Imagine this, a group of men laughing on the shore of a peaceful lake. Their leader, loud and arrogant, shouts at an elderly black man in a tiny wooden boat. "Move your boat! You don't belong here!" But what they didn't know was shocking, because that quiet fisherman wasn't just another visitor. He was the owner of the entire lake, and within minutes, their arrogance would be crushed, and their fishing club destroyed. Those sharp words cut across the stillness of the lake, breaking what had been a quiet, peaceful morning. They were shouted at an elderly black man who sat calmly in his small wooden boat, fishing with the kind of patience that only comes from years of experience. His face was relaxed, his hands steady, and his eyes fixed on the rippling water, completely at peace with his surroundings. But that peace was suddenly shattered. The man turned his head slowly, surprised but not shaken, to see a group of men on the shore. They were members of a local fishing club, laughing among themselves, with one of them, loud, arrogant, and brimming with authority, standing out from the rest. His name was Corin, the self-proclaimed leader of the group. He had a reputation in town for being bossy, territorial, and quick to judge. And today, his eyes had locked onto the lone fisherman in the middle of the lake. The old man didn't say a word at first. He simply adjusted his fishing rod as if he hadn't heard the insult. But Corin wasn't the kind to be ignored. His voice rose again, louder and harsher this time. "I said move! This area is for club members only. You don't belong here." The other men smirked and nodded in agreement, watching like spectators at a show. To them it was simple. This stranger was trespassing on their lake, their fishing spot, their territory, and in their eyes he had no right to be there. But the elderly fisherman was different. There was no anger in his eyes, no trace of fear, and no sign that he was about to back down. Instead, he sat still, letting the water ripple around his boat, his calm presence in complete contrast to the rising storm of voices from the shore. What they didn't know, what not a single one of them could have guessed, was that this man held a truth so powerful it would turn their laughter into silence, and their arrogance into shame. What seemed like a small clash between a fisherman and a fishing club was about to become a story they would never forget. The story unfolds at Lake Serenity, a hidden jewel of the countryside. The lake stretched wide and calm, surrounded by rolling hills and tall trees that whispered in the breeze. Early mornings were magical there. The mist would rise gently from the water's surface, birds would sing in the distance, and the soft rippling of the lake created an atmosphere of perfect peace. To most people, it was simply a place of beauty. But to some, it was a stage, a place to show off power and authority. Every weekend, Lake Serenity came alive. Pickup trucks and SUVs lined the gravel roads leading to the shore. Tents, coolers, and fishing gear filled the banks, and laughter echoed across the water. Among all the groups that gathered there, one stood out. The local fishing club led by a man named Corin. Howe wasn't just any fisherman. He saw himself as the king of Lake Serenity. He had organized the club years ago, gathering men who shared his love of fishing, but also his pride in control. Together, they strutted around the lake like they owned it. They had their favorite spots marked, their rules made clear, and they treated newcomers with suspicion. If anyone dared to sit in a place they considered theirs, they wasted no time in telling them to move. And they didn't whisper it, they boasted about it openly. "This is our lake," they would say. "If you want to fish here, you follow our rules." For years, nobody challenged them. People either avoided the lake or kept their distance from the club. And so, Corin and his men grew more and more confident, acting like gatekeepers of a place that wasn't theirs to begin with. Howe, tall and loud, was the loudest voice of them all. He enjoyed being in control, barking orders, and making himself the center of attention. His club members admired him, laughed at his jokes, and followed his lead. It gave him a sense of importance he craved. To them, weekends at Lake Serenity weren't just about fishing, they were about showing dominance over anyone who dared step into their territory. What none of them realized, however, was that their kingdom stood on a foundation of assumption. The lake they so proudly claimed as their own had a story much deeper than they knew, and soon that truth was about to surface in a way they never expected. It was a sunny Saturday morning at Lake Serenity, the kind of day fishermen dreamed about. The water shimmered like glass, reflecting the blue sky above. The sound of laughter and chatter echoed from the shoreline as members of HAO, Corin's fishing club, unpacked their gear. They set up rods, unfolded lawn chairs, and cracked open coolers, preparing themselves for a long day of fishing and bragging. For them, this was routine. It was their weekend ritual, and in their minds, they ruled the lake. But then something unexpected caught their eyes. Out in the middle of the lake, drifting gently on the still water, was a small old wooden boat. Inside it sat a lone man. He wasn't laughing, boasting, or calling attention to himself like the club members did. Instead, he sat perfectly still, rod in hand, eyes focused on the water in front of him. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost meditative, as though he was in complete harmony with the lake. The man was dressed modestly, a plain shirt, worn trousers, and a sun-faded hat pulled low over his brow. His boat wasn't flashy either. It had no shiny paint or modern motor, just a simple paddle resting along the side. Yet there was something dignified about him, something in the way he carried himself. He radiated calm, as if nothing could disturb his peace. The commotion from the shore didn't seem to bother him at all. The laughter, the loud voices, even the sound of beer cans cracking open, he remained focused, patient, and quiet. To him, the lake was not a place to prove power or show off. It was a place of serenity, just as its name suggested. But to HAO Corin and his club, his very presence felt wrong. They weren't used to strangers in their territory. Who was this man? Why was he here, sitting so comfortably in the very waters they claimed as their own? Some members muttered under their breath, curious but also suspicious. Others chuckled, assuming he must be lost or ignorant of their so-called rules. Little did they know this quiet, modest man was not lost at all. He was exactly where he belonged. And soon, the truth of who he was would turn their arrogance into pure silence. HAO Corin was never the type to let things slide. In the small circle of his fishing club, he thrived on being the loudest voice, the one who made the rules, and the one who decided who belonged where. To him, Lake Serenity wasn't just a lake, it was his personal stage. And when he spotted the quiet fisherman sitting calmly in the middle of the water, his ego flared instantly. Something about the man bothered him. Maybe it was his stillness, his silence, or perhaps the fact that he looked completely unshaken by the club's noisy presence. To HAO, this man didn't fit in. He wasn't laughing, drinking, or trying to impress anyone. He wasn't part of their club, and that alone, in HAO's eyes, made him an intruder. Without a second thought, HAO cupped his hands to his mouth and bellowed across the lake. "Hey, you! Move your boat to the other side. This spot is for club members only." The words ripped through the peaceful air like a stone thrown into still water. The men on shore immediately burst into laughter. To them, this was entertainment. They leaned back in their chairs, grinning, waiting to see how the stranger would react. After all, when HAO spoke, most people listened. One member chuckled, nudging another. "He'll move. Nobody argues with HAO." Another smirked, adding, "Bet he's new around here, doesn't know who runs this place." The confidence in their leader was absolute. HAO had built his authority on intimidation, on being louder and bolder than anyone else. Most locals avoided confrontation with him, preferring peace over conflict. So, naturally, the club expected the fishermen to paddle away quietly, embarrassed and defeated. But the man in the old wooden boat didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He kept his eyes on the water, his hands steady on the fishing rod, as though HAO's voice had never touched him. His calmness, his refusal to acknowledge the demand, created a tension that the men on shore hadn't anticipated. HAO's grin faded. His command hadn't worked. And for a man used to instant obedience, that silence was more insulting than any words could ever be. This was no ordinary fisherman, and HAO Corin was about to find that out in a way that would change everything. The fisherman's reaction wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of snapping back, instead of showing anger or even annoyance, he simply lifted his gaze, offered a small, polite smile, and said in a calm voice, "I'm fine right here. Thank you." That was it. No argument, no explanation, just quiet confidence. For a moment, the lake seemed even more still, as if nature itself paused to listen. The man's words floated across the water, gentle but firm, carrying more weight than the club members wanted to admit. It wasn't defiance spoken with aggression. It was defiance spoken with peace. And that only made it sting worse. On the shore, Hal Corrin's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to people answering him like that. Most people in town either feared him or simply didn't care enough to argue. But this man? He wasn't afraid, and he certainly wasn't moving. Hayo's face darkened. His pride wouldn't allow such a response to go unchallenged. He stomped closer to the water's edge, his voice rising with every step. "Didn't you hear me? I said move!" His words echoed across the lake, louder and harsher than before. Behind him, the club members snickered and jeered, egging him on like schoolyard bullies watching their leader pick a fight. "Show him who's boss, Hal!" one shouted. "Yeah, don't let him sit there like he owns the place," another added, laughing. Their voices fueled Hao's anger, but the fisherman didn't so much as twitch. He remained steady, his fishing rod resting lightly in his hands, his boat rocking gently with the ripples of the water. He looked as though he was the only person on the lake, completely unbothered by the shouting man and his chorus of supporters. That quietness, his refusal to rise to Hao's aggression, wasn't weakness, it was power. And Hao felt it even if he didn't understand it. Every second the fisherman refused to move. Every second he stayed calm. Hao's authority slipped away in front of the very men he wanted to impress. It was a battle of wills, shouted pride versus silent strength. And though nobody realized it yet, the man in the old wooden boat was already winning. As Hal Corrin's voice thundered across the lake and the fishermen refused to budge, a strange shift began among the fishing club members. The laughter that had filled the air moments ago softened into uneasy murmurs. The men exchanged curious glances, whispering behind Hao's back. They weren't quite sure what to make of this situation. "Who is this guy?" one muttered under his breath. "Never seen him around here before?" another replied. "Probably just some stranger who doesn't know the rules," a third added, smirking. Their whispers carried the tone of arrogance, but also something else, uncertainty. None of them truly knew the man sitting quietly in that old boat, and that unfamiliarity unsettled them. For years, they had been used to people bowing to their authority, tiptoeing around Hal Corrin's inflated ego. Yet here was a man who didn't seem impressed, intimidated, or even bothered. One member chuckled nervously, trying to mask the tension. "Maybe he's trespassing. Hao should just kick him out, ban him from the lake for good." Another laughed a little too loudly, adding, "Yeah, wouldn't be the first time we've had to show someone the rules." But even as they joked, their eyes remained fixed on the fisherman. His calmness was disarming. The more he sat there silently, the more their confidence wavered. They could sense something different about him, something that didn't quite fit their assumptions. The tension grew heavier with every passing second. The club members leaned on their rods, crossed their arms or fidgeted with their coolers, trying to act casual but unable to look away. They wanted the man to move, not just because Hao demanded it, but because his stillness made them feel uneasy, like they were watching a storm gather on the horizon. Every ripple of the water, every quiet breeze seemed to amplify the fisherman's presence. He wasn't loud, he wasn't threatening, but somehow he held the lake in his grasp with nothing more than his silence. And though the club didn't realize it yet, their nervous whispers were the first cracks in the wall of arrogance they had built around Lake Serenity. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of taunts, demands, and laughter, the quiet fisherman moved. Slowly, he set down his fishing rod, letting it rest gently against the side of the boat. The ripples spread softly across the lake as he rose to his feet. Every eye on the shoreline locked onto him. The laughter faded into silence. Even Hao Corrin, red-faced and puffed up with anger, paused to see what the man would do. The fisherman adjusted his hat, stood tall despite the rocking of the small wooden boat, and looked directly at Hao. His eyes were calm, steady, eyes that carried a quiet authority. Then, in a voice that was neither loud nor angry, but impossibly firm, he spoke words that froze the air in place. "You know, I don't need to move, because this lake belongs to me." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The words hung in the air, echoing across the water, heavier than anything the men had expected. The silence that followed was deafening. The club members blinked at one another in disbelief. Had they heard him right? This man, this stranger in an old boat, was claiming ownership of Lake Serenity? Some exchanged doubtful glances. Others stifled nervous chuckles, thinking it must be some kind of joke. But deep down, something about the man's tone told them otherwise. Hao Koren was the first to break the silence, barking out a forced laugh. "What are you talking about?" "This isn't your lake! This is our spot! We've been fishing here for years." His voice cracked with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty, a thin layer of confidence trying to cover his growing unease. But the fisherman didn't flinch. He stood as steady as the trees surrounding the water. His words were not a threat, not a bluff, but a statement of fact. And that certainty began to sink into the minds of everyone watching. The men on shore shifted uncomfortably, their bravado slipping. Something told them this was no ordinary fisherman. This was the turning point, the exact moment when the power shifted, when arrogance began to crumble, and when Hao Koren and his club realized they might not be as in control as they thought. At first, the fishing club erupted in nervous chuckles. The idea seemed absurd to them. How could this quiet, modest man possibly own the lake they had claimed for so many years? To Hao Koren and his loyal followers, it sounded like nothing more than a bluff, a desperate attempt to avoid humiliation. "He's joking," one member muttered, shaking his head. Another laughed. "Yeah, right, next he'll say he owns the whole town." Even Hao himself smirked, folding his arms across his chest. "Nice story, old man. But this is our lake. We've been here every weekend. Everyone knows that." But the fisherman didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he moved with quiet confidence, reaching into a worn leather bag sitting at his feet. The boat rocked gently as he pulled out a thick, folded bundle of papers, carefully preserved, edges yellowed with time. He held them up for all to see. The sunlight caught the embossed seal at the top of the first page, a seal that made several men on shore lean forward with sudden seriousness. In a steady, measured voice, he declared, "My family has owned Lake Serenity for generations. Every inch of this water, every ripple you see before you, it is private property." The words cut through the crowd like a knife. The chuckling stopped. Jaws went slack. A few of the men shifted uncomfortably, whispering, "Wait, is he serious?" Others leaned closer, squinting at the papers as if trying to read them from across the water. Hao Koren's smirk faltered. He could see the official stamps, the signatures, the legal markings that proved this wasn't just a random piece of paper. This was real documentation, ownership records passed down through generations. The old fisherman didn't gloat, didn't sneer, didn't need to shout. His calm delivery was enough. He had just dismantled years of arrogance with nothing more than the truth. The shoreline, once full of laughter and bravado, had fallen into a heavy silence. The so-called rulers of Lake Serenity suddenly looked like children, caught trespassing in someone else's yard. And Hao Koren? His authority, his pride, and his control were slipping away with every second the papers remained in view. Hao Koren's face flushed a deep shade of red, the kind of red that comes not just from anger, but from humiliation. His chest puffed up, and he let out a forced laugh that rang hollow in the sudden quiet. "That can't be true," he shouted, his voice louder than necessary, as if volume alone could make the fisherman's words false. "This is our fishing club's lake. We've been here for years. Everyone knows that." But his laughter fell flat. The men around him, once so quick to back him up, didn't join in this time. They weren't laughing. They were staring at the documents in the fisherman's hands. The stamped seals and official, markings that carried more authority than Hao's bluster ever could. The fisherman didn't even bother to argue. He didn't raise his voice, didn't match Hao's desperation. He simply stood there on his boat, calm as ever, holding the truth in his hands. The more composed he was, the more foolish Hao looked. "Come on, guys," Hao barked, turning to his men, trying to regain control. "You don't believe this nonsense, do you? We've been fishing here longer than this guy's been showing his face. This is our spot." But the club members shifted uneasily. Some avoided his eyes. Others whispered among themselves, no longer with confidence but with doubt. One of them muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "Papers don't lie, Hao." Another scratched his head, mumbling, "If he really owns the lake, we've been trespassing this whole time." The realization stung. Hao could feel his authority slipping like water through his fingers. For years, he had strutted around Lake Serenity, barking orders and boasting about control. Now, in a matter of minutes, a single fisherman had shattered that illusion. Desperate to hold on to some shred of dignity, Hao tried one last time. "You can't just show up here and claim something like this. It doesn't work that way." His words trembled, his confidence unraveling. But deep down, even Howe knew the truth. The papers in that fisherman's hands held more weight than his years of false claims. His reign over Lake Serenity had ended, and the sting of embarrassment cut deeper than any hook ever could. With the papers still in his hand, the fisherman took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the lake with an unmistakable steadiness, the kind that made every man on the shore lean in to listen. "My grandfather purchased this lake decades ago," he said, his eyes scanning the group. "Long before your fishing club ever set foot here, this land and this water already belonged to my family. It was passed down to my father and then to me." The words hit harder than Hay-O Corin wanted to admit. He shifted uncomfortably while the rest of the club stood silent. The fisherman continued, his tone calm but firm. "Over the years, people stopped asking who owned the lake. They assumed it was public because I never stopped anyone from fishing here. I allowed the townsfolk to enjoy it freely, families, travelers, anyone who came with respect for the water. I wanted people to find peace here, the same peace my family always cherished." He paused for a moment, glancing at the papers before folding them carefully back into his bag. "But just because I allowed people to use the lake," he added, "does not mean it ever stopped being mine." The men on shore shifted uneasily, exchanging guilty looks. They realized then that their fishing club had been built on nothing more than assumption, an illusion of control they had convinced themselves was real. Then the fisherman's voice grew just slightly sharper, though still measured. "I've watched you for years," he said, eyes settling on Howe. "Your group comes here, loud and boastful, acting like you own the place. I let it slide. But today you crossed the line. You disrespected me without even knowing who I am." A heavy silence followed. Not one of the men dared to speak. The fisherman's words carried the weight of history, of truth and of justice all at once. For the first time since he'd formed his so-called club, Howe Corin realized he was standing not on his own authority, but on borrowed ground that never belonged to him at all. The fisherman's calm demeanor never wavered, but his eyes sharpened as he turned his gaze directly toward Howe. Corin and the men clustered behind him. For the first time, there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. "You and your club are no longer welcome here," he said firmly. "Pack up your things and leave immediately." The words sliced through the air like a blade. No shouting, no threats, just pure certainty. The silence that followed was suffocating. The once proud members of HAO's fishing club shifted uncomfortably, their bravado crumbling in the weight of the truth. They looked at one another for reassurance, but none was found. Every man knew they were standing on ground that was not theirs, and the man in the boat had just claimed it back. Howe Corin's mouth opened as if to argue, but nothing came out. His reputation as the loud, controlling leader meant nothing in this moment. His confidence had been stripped bare, replaced with a humiliation he could feel burning on the back of his neck. One by one, the club members began lowering their eyes. The laughter and mocking that had once fueled their arrogance had vanished completely. Their hands fumbled with their coolers and fishing rods, the metallic clinks and rustling bags the only sounds to fill the heavy silence. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to challenge the man who had just shattered years of false ownership with a single declaration. Even the lake itself seemed to echo the fisherman's command. The water rippled softly around his boat, as though nature itself acknowledged him as the rightful keeper of Lake Serenity. With their pride deflated and their leader silent, the men did the only thing they could do. They gathered their gear. Slowly, awkwardly, like school children caught misbehaving, they began walking back toward their trucks. Their usual swagger was gone, replaced with the shuffle of men carrying the weight of embarrassment. Howe was the last to move, his fists clenched at his sides, his face burning red. But even he couldn't deny the truth. The lake was not his. It never had been. And in that moment, with every step away from the water, he felt the sting of defeat sharper than any hook. The king of Lake Serenity had been dethroned. Here's the 400-word expansion of The Lesson Learned section, showing how the story spread and what people thought of it. By the following week, the incident at Lake Serenity had become the talk of the town. What had begun as a simple fishing trip for HAO, Corin's club had turned into a tale everyone seemed eager to retell. In diners, barber shops, and grocery stores, people leaned across counters and tables, whispering and laughing, about how the self-proclaimed king of the lake had been humbled in front of his own men. "Did you hear about HAO?" One customer chuckled to a store clerk. "Oh, you mean when he tried to kick the lake owner off his own water?" The clerk replied, shaking his head with a grin. The story spread like wildfire, and each time it was told, the embarrassment grew for Hao Koren. For years, he had strutted around with his fishing club, intimidating newcomers, claiming spots, and acting as if the lake belonged to him. Now the truth had been revealed, and the town wasn't about to let him forget it. People said it was the perfect example of arrogance backfiring. Hao hadn't just embarrassed himself, he had embarrassed his entire club. Instead of being respected leaders of the lake, they were now the punchline of every joke. Children teased each other by shouting, "Move your boat!" before laughing, imitating Hao's outburst. Even those who had once tolerated his behavior found themselves shaking their heads, muttering, "Serves him right." But beyond the laughter, there was a deeper conversation brewing. Many pointed out how quickly Hao had judged the fisherman, not by his actions, but by his appearance. He had seen an elderly black man in an old wooden boat and assumed weakness, assumed he didn't belong. That prejudice, combined with arrogance, had led directly to his humiliation. The fisherman, on the other hand, earned respect far beyond the lake. People admired the way he had handled the confrontation, with calmness, dignity, and unwavering truth. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't tried to embarrass anyone. He had simply stood his ground with quiet authority, proving that true strength doesn't always shout. In the end, the story became more than just gossip. It became a reminder, one that echoed through the town. Respect others, because you never know who you're truly speaking to. And so, what began as nothing more than an arrogant attempt to push a quiet fisherman away became a lesson that the entire town would remember for years to come. That day at Lake Serenity showed just how dangerous it is to judge others based only on appearance, and how quickly false power can crumble when it's tested by the truth. The fisherman, with his modest clothes and old wooden boat, had been underestimated from the very start. Hao Koren and his club saw someone they thought was weak, someone who didn't belong, someone they could push aside without consequence. But in reality, that quiet man held more power than all of them, combined. Not just because he owned the lake, but because he carried himself with dignity, patience, and strength. It's a reminder that appearances can deceive us. Just because someone doesn't look wealthy, loud, or important doesn't mean they lack influence. True authority often comes in the calmest, quietest forms. The fisherman didn't need to yell, didn't need to threaten, and didn't need to fight. His truth spoke louder than all of Hao's shouting. The second lesson is just as important. Never assume control over something that isn't yours. Hao's fishing club acted like rulers of the lake, making their own rules, pushing others around, and enjoying a power they had never actually earned. But borrowed authority always collapses when faced with reality. Ownership, respect, and truth will always outweigh arrogance and noise. Finally, the story teaches one of the most timeless lessons of all. Always treat people with respect. It costs nothing to be kind, but it can cost everything to be cruel. Hao's downfall wasn't just about the lake, it was about his disrespect. If he had treated the fisherman with basic courtesy, things might have ended differently. But because he led with arrogance and prejudice, he walked away humiliated. So the next time you feel the urge to judge, remember Lake Serenity. Remember the quiet man in the boat, who showed that real strength doesn't need to shout. And remember that the person you try to push aside may actually hold the power to change everything. And that's the story of how arrogance met its match at Lake Serenity. If you enjoyed this story and the lesson it carries, don't forget to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. Until next time, remember, respect costs nothing, but it can change everything.